Lovely. And as we pull forward, as we go forward, wind your reverser back.
Clive Groom is teaching some of the skills of driving, using an old Great Western engine whose origins can be traced right back to the 19th century. One by one, the trainees take the controls.
When you shut the regulator to coast, reopen it so that that comes on that bend, and that will give you steam through with your oil, okay?
Okay.
Coast at 45% when you shut the regulator.
Okay.
Bring it back to 3 turns from mid when you're running.
And that's there and there, yeah?
Yeah, and if the brake sticks on, a little flick will get it off 9 times out of 10.
Okay.
Okay, so put it in 4 gear ready. Handbrake off, please, thank you. So now if you make the brake with a big jet, and although we've got 21, the brake still may stick on if you don't give it that little flick.
Well, try it and see. Yeah?
Well, yeah.
Okay.
See what we've got in the signal department.
Signal, we're clear, thank you.
And whistle, 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 whistle. Yeah, it went away all right, didn't it?
By the end of the week, the people on the course will be able to handle the engine quite well, helped by the unflappable Mr. Groom, a kindly character who is, not surprisingly, rather at home on a footplate after 55 years there. His colleague, Mick Blackburn, is on the other side of the footplate, teaching the trainee firemen. The footplate Days and Ways courses represent hands-on training at its very best. And soon they're bustling through the countryside like old hands, though Clive is always at pains to point out that it would take years to be allowed to operate the engine for real. Trainees don't know the road ahead, so can't use the judgment of speed and distance that was part of the heavy responsibility that sat on a driver's shoulders.
The responsibility of a driver didn't have to be a mainline driver, but the responsibility of a driver was immense. The machine, the cost, the capital cost of the machine that you were in charge of, the lives, the fact that your train might be quite safe, but you might endanger another train if you made a mistake, was always a very heavy burden. And the penalties were manslaughter charges, imprisonment for any mistake you made. The inquiries into an accident go into what you did, the relationships with your wife, any mental problems you've got, any political problems, and your actions, which were the matter of 20 seconds of judgment, would be pondered over by a dozen people with the time to think about every possible alternative action you could have taken in that situation. It was one of those jobs like a ship's captain, like an airline pilot, where you get a lot of enjoyment out of doing it, a lot of kudos for doing it, but tremendous recriminations if you can be proved to have done it wrongly.
It was the job every schoolboy wanted, but only a madman would take on.
It's madness, first of all, to drive a boiler through the air at 85 miles an hour. A boiler should be bolted down to a concrete plinth, not on wheels, whizzing through the darkness at 85 miles an hour. It's utter madness. It's a mobile bomb. You're standing on a platform at the back of it. Masses of boiling water, thousands of degrees of heat, hundreds of tons of train, and you're at the front end of it, propelling it through the darkness, trusting that signals are going to be correctly set, that the rails are correctly maintained, that the tunnel isn't blocked by anything when you hit it, and you can't even see the tunnel at night. You just know you're in it by the whoop as you go into it. It's total madness, and it's only done because you're brought up to do it from the age of 16 onwards. Now, at some point, if something goes desperately wrong, the possibility of things going wrong suddenly hits you. So a man who's had a nasty collision where he's felt that terrible crump of hitting something, you never forget it.
These rare colour pictures from the 1960s show something of the drama of steam at speed. It was a job full of sound and fury. Nowadays, in stiller waters, people queue up for an insight into that half-forgotten world of steam locomotion. There's tremendous demand for footplate experience among people who'd rather be doing something interesting with their holidays than lying on a beach somewhere. And it turns out to be great fun.
I think my way was better if we were getting there.
A few days later, Clive groom and daughters are back on volunteer duty at the Bluebell. Today, Clive will be driving, but not before the trio have cleaned the engine from top to bottom. The mechanical lubricators need filling again, and Rebecca's hard at work on wheels she's cleaned many, many times before. Someone else did part of the work in steam days, but at 70 years of age, Clive finds himself climbing about like a mountain goat beneath the engine as enthusiastically as ever. This is no more than a medium-sized railway locomotive, but that tiny dome on top is actually huge, like everything else on a railway engine. These brake blocks are a foot long and seem to have caught Clive's eye on his daily rounds.
While I'm in this area, I'm just looking at the brake blocks. They're not very thick. They're down to their last bit of metal. It wears away, of course, being cast iron rubbing on a steel wheel. And the gap that exists between the brake block and the wheel is the reason why, when I put the brakes on, you'll hear a great big thump as the brakes come in and hit the wheels. You'll notice that later. And here we have one of the corks. Now these corks are a very efficient way of sealing the top of an oil well. There's no weight in that cork. If it flies out, it doesn't kill anybody or do any damage. If it enters the body of the oil receptacle, it won't cause any damage to the bearing. It's a simple, homely household device, like the wool that you just saw in the trimming, which is part of the oiling machinery of an engine. A little finger in there to get rid of the excess oil, pop it in, a little screw round and wipe the excess off, or else the cleaner will be cross. But you can see that the basic oiling, even including doing the mechanical lubricator this side, there's a similar mechanical lubricator the other side with thicker oil in it. Even doing that, I could get the whole job done in about 20 minutes. And including the business of taking coal, filling up with water, testing the injectors, testing the sands, you have to test the vacuum brake. You can do all of that and still leave the shed in 35 minutes from the time you finish reading your notices and walking to the engine.
Right away. Right away. Okay. Top shut. Pop on the whistle. Bit of speed. There we go.
It's immediately obvious that Clive isn't doing very much. He's set the controls and will now handle the engine with a light rein.
If I set an engine, I leave it set. And then the fireman works out how much coal he's burning per mile and feeds that much. If you constantly alter these things, the fireman has to constantly alter the rate. The fireman is like the carburettor on a car. And if you set your foot on the accelerator, the carburettor will work away at that setting. The fireman works away like a carburettor. And if you muck him around too much, he's constantly altering his rhythm.
How does the driver adjust the power and Steam's version of a gearbox with its infinitely variable valves?
Yeah, driving engines is infinitely variable with very little instrumentation. So you don't aim to get an instrument doing a certain thing. You aim to get the engine doing a certain thing through a mixture of controlled settings. And it actually takes probably 3 days of work on an engine to find out where that engine really likes to be worked. From the fireman's point of view, it takes 3 days of firing to an engine to work out exactly how it likes to be fired best. Now, the problem of getting a certain speed out of an engine is a difficult one because of this variable nature of the control settings. You can give it loads and loads of regulator, as the textbook says, and you can give it a short cut-off, as the textbook says, but if the valves are not working exactly as they should be working, that engine is going to make itself blind and not increase in speed. So you adjust the regulator, you adjust the reverser, and you feel through your bones, as it were, whether the engine is taking it nicely and galloping. And you find a position where the engine gallops loosely and easily.
A driver needs to know at all times exactly where he is on the journey, especially in bad weather or darkness.
A good engineman will scarcely have to put his head out of the cab window. A bad engineman will have a black face and eyes like a panda, because he'll have his head well out of the window looking for the signal before the signal will be truly visible to him. If you know the road so well that you drive along blindly between signals, and then when you know the signal's there, you put the blower on to throw the steam a bit higher from the window, and then look out and catch the signal, and then put your head back in again and ease the blower off again, that's a good engineman. He ends up with a clean face. You can see enginemen sometimes who don't know the road, and they're nervous as kittens, and they're looking out long before the signal's going to be there. The other thing is that you should always be aware of what the firebed is doing, even though you're not looking at it. So while you're driving and you're looking at signals, you know by the rhythm of the engine that it's keeping time. You take a glance across at the pressure gauge and it seems to be okay, but you've noticed that the fireman hasn't thrown any coal in for a bit. And the last time he threw the coal in, you were pretty sure he didn't reach the front corner on your side. So when the steam starts to drop back and the fireman looks puzzled, you say to him, chuck a couple in that front corner my side. And he'll think, how the bloody hell does he think he knows that? You know? And he'll throw a couple into that front corner and then the pressure will be okay again. But it's not magic, because the whole time he's driving, he's aware of what you're doing. He sees the way you shovel, he thinks that didn't get there. He counts the number of shovelfuls you put down one side and how many you put down the other side, and he sees whether you favour one side over the other, and so on. And that's what a driver is doing as well as driving.
Contrary to popular myth, driving an express passenger train wasn't the trickiest job for a driver. The really tough one was goods work. The kings of the road were freight crews taking loose-coupled trains over undulating routes.
The freight train driver and the freight train guard are the cleverest people that run trains on the railway. But all drivers are freight train drivers before they are passenger train drivers, so that they understand fully the dangers of letting the speed overcome your braking ability. Your average speed of the freight train is about 35 miles an hour because of the stopping problem. Now, if you come over the brow of a hill or approaching a stop signal, and you've got the brakes full on and it's still moving, even though it's only moving at 1 mile an hour, you're still in trouble. Because inevitably you get pushed past the signal or into something and you're in dead trouble. You can't do anything about it. And that is horrifying. And it's part of the nightmare that most drivers have at some point when they're in bed at night. And the art of freight train driving is to always have a bit in hand that you know you've got space to stop in. And it is a frightening experience, a horrible experience. It's just the sheer inevitability of a slow-speed disaster. If you're doing it at high speed, well, you're obviously an idiot. But you reverse the engine, you apply steam to the front, in the opposite end of the cylinders, you know, that helps you to stop. But not if you've got too much way on. It's like trying to stop a battleship that's been allowed to come up into a dock a little bit too fast. You've got a mass of inertia there, a mass of kinetic energy, and you're trying to kill it in the distance that you've got left, and you hadn't allowed enough time to kill it.
Clive remembers the C-class engines as being some of the most difficult to stop when they were on goods duty.
What we found was that they were extremely strong, very, very strong, but their brakes were no good. Remember, we were working freight trains, not passenger trains. Now, when you're working a freight train, the only brakes you've got are the engine's brakes and the brake van at the back. If you have 600 tons on with a C-class, although you can pull 600 tons, you've got a very hard job to stop 600 tons. We were used as firemen to walking over to the handbrake and checking the train down. When you tried to do that with a C, nothing happened. Then when the driver put the brake on, nothing happened again, because the arrangement of the brakes on the C is such that there's hardly any braking effect. So although we liked them for their pulling abilities, we didn't much care for them in comparison with Brighton engines for their stopping abilities.
One of his toughest freight trips was with a Q1, Bulleid's outlandish wartime austerity class.
It was an engine that came to our shed, was turned round and half soled and healed and sent out again. Now that's railwayman jargon. For an engine that hasn't had the fire cleaned properly, it's done already 8 hours work, and it's going to be turned around for a new crew to do another 8 hours work. So looking in the fire, I could see the colour of it wasn't right. So when we hooked onto the train, I said to the fireman, put the vacuum pipes up, because it was a partially fitted freight train. But I said I won't create a vacuum, because once you make a vacuum, if you can't keep enough steam to maintain the vacuum, the brakes go on. But if you haven't made a vacuum, then if you haven't got enough steam to make a vacuum, it doesn't matter. So we set off with no vacuum in the train, just as an ordinary unfitted freight train. And sure enough, my fireman couldn't make it steam. We climbed up the bank from Clapham to Earlsfield, through Earlsfield and down to Wimbledon, and things were already going wrong. And thank God I hadn't put the brake vacuum up, because our pressure soon fell below the 90 pounds that we needed. From 220, it had fallen below 90. And had the brakes been attached, we'd have had the train stop. But we kept on, with the pressure dropping below 90 to 80, and we managed to keep that train rolling with only 60 pounds of steam in the boiler, keeping the boiler water just in sight all the time. And bear in mind, we're climbing most of the time. And it was pouring with rain. The cab was full of steam from all the valves and things that blew steam because it was in such bad order. The water was dripping down from the condensation in the cab roof and drenching us even though we weren't out in the rain. It was humid, miserable and horrible. And then the rain stopped and we started the last little bit to Basingstoke, and we knew we were going to get there by then. And I was leaning out of the cab window and there was a smell of wet grass, dead rabbits, mist in the air. And even with that old chonker, and having battled for nearly 50 miles, I still thought, well, there was a triumph in having made it, actually. We hadn't had to use the brakes because it was largely uphill. Had we needed to stop, I would have made the vacuum and we would have very quickly stopped. But that was an epic trip on one of the most run-down old Q1s. It was scrapped shortly afterwards that I've ever been on. And it needed the fireman to work diligently at that fire. Although he could only make 60 pounds of steam, he never stopped working. He wasn't sitting on his bottom. He wasn't praying, which is a thing that often comes to your mind, that you should pray and maybe that'll help. It doesn't. I've done a lot of it. You just got to diligently work on that fire with spoonfuls, literally spoonfuls of dust, to any bright spot that sparks up somewhere in it. You've got the 12-foot long pricker in your hand half the time, raking and poking at it to try and get some flame through it. But what you mustn't do is touch the bars with the pricker, because if you touch the fire bars, you pull the dust up into the fire, and that actually makes clinker, which would compound your trouble.
This sole survivor of the Q1 class is owned by the National Railway Museum and spent a while at the Bluebell. As it leaves the station, the next train in is hauled by the Standard Class 4.
Elizabeth's just evened up the sides and edges of the firebed. Each side has got to be equally deep. So she's run her eye down it and she's seen that there's the occasional place where the firebed isn't equal to the other side. So she's built them both up so that the draft takes the same pressure on both sides. And she'll try and maintain that by the way she distributes the shovels going up the hill. And you'll see the fire getting whiter and whiter and whiter under the blast. And if she doesn't move fast, she'll end up with those uncovered elbows of her with blisters on. I wouldn't fire bare arm. The first time I fired the Salisbury, I got a blister through my sleeves, despite the fact I had my sleeves down. These things, the heat is so intense, it bites like a screw being driven into your skin. That's what it feels like. That ring round the door there is light in colour, not black. Do you see that? It's because the heat of the fire has burnt all the soot off it. And that's the sign of a really hot fire, if the fire hole door goes a pale bluey colour. And the other sign is if you look in the chimney, and you look down the chimney and it's not black but blue, a pale blue, that means the fireman's had the fire really, really white hot. Here we go.
Like many preserved railways, the Bluebell is a hilly route, and with half a dozen carriages, the engine will have to work for its keep. its driver will juggle the controls, trying to limit the draft on the fire when working hard to avoid lifting burning cinders from the grate and then ejecting them from the chimney. This is especially true when there's a thin fire. Air from underneath will be able to pick up small coals and literally make the firebed dance. Some crews deliberately ran with a thick fire, and blacking out a bullet was one way of keeping cool on the footplate. But Mr. Groom didn't really approve. He can remember taking over Merchant Navy class engines at Salisbury from Exeter men and discovering there was too much fuel in the box. The problem with having half a ton too much fire was that any interruption in water supply could be catastrophic.
The Exeter men used to run with an extremely heavy fire. And when we took over from them at Salisbury, I could work their fire down to my thinness halfway to London. The stuff they put in, I could work down and work down and work down until I could fire to it myself for the last 25 miles into London. So you could do it, but I wouldn't do it. People on the LBSC used to pack the fireboxes of the H2s absolutely solid with coal, and they reckoned they could get to Brighton with it. But it's a very risky thing to do, because if something goes wrong, you've got a box full of fire and no water in the boiler. And then what do you do? So my method was always to fire to it in accordance with the consumption and no more.
Observing and obeying signals looks straightforward enough on a sunny day, but what about night time and bad weather? All drivers had their moments of uncertainty, even terror. Had they missed a signal?
The thing that goes through your mind is the need to keep a strict check on where you are on the line at any moment. You must never look forward too far or think backwards to what happened just now. You must always be concentrating on the next signal that you're due to see. How many are there between each station? Whereabouts will they be in relation to the bridges that you go through or tunnels that you go through? So it's a bit like walking along on a foggy night and trying to keep a track on the road turnings that you pass so that you know when to take the turning for your road when you can't see anything except 2 or 3 steps in front of you. And it's like that on a steam engine at speed with the darkness on a moonless night with the steam beating down over your window.
The difference between full sunshine and deepest night is instantly obvious when a steam locomotive plunges into a tunnel. Imagine spending several hours in pitch darkness.
Your ability to keep a check on where you are on the line at any moment is very, very important. You've got to look across to the fireman and sort of inquiringly look at him if he can see a signal on a bend and you can't. He will have stopped firing long enough to accustomize his eyes to the darkness so that he can look out, catch that signal, give you the thumbs up, no shouting or screaming or anything like that, just a quiet thumbs up. You trust him, you carry on at the same speed.
There's a good fireman. When the hard work's done, a good fireman cleans the whole place up and makes it look as though there was no effort expended on the job. And when they arrive in the station, people climbing on the engine think, well, they haven't been up to much. Everything looks neat and tidy. It's a nice trick.
Then you get to the point where all the drivers shut off, because there's no point driving down a hill if you can roll down it just as fast. So all drivers will shut off at point X. You reach point X, you whack the blower on to stop blowback, you slam the regulator shut, and the engine just carries on and on and on and on until it's time where you start applying the brake. And that too is something that all drivers will do at a certain point, because they know that's the last possible chance to put the brake on.
There we are.
So what was a day in the life of an engineman like in the era of steam? Each morning was bound to begin in a misty haze, as cold engines with open drain cocks banished water from their steam passages, like big horses with plumes of condensation from their nostrils. It gave the tiptoeing leviathans an ethereal quality as they loomed up inside their self-propelled fog banks. For Clive Groom, the daily grind came in the shape of 140 tons of bullied Pacific. In those days, the engineman's fervent prayer was that other people like fitters and firelighters had done their job well, for preparing an engine was an art form in itself, and would determine the sort of day the footplate crew would have.
The art is to make the fire up properly. The fire will have been made up during the hour before the engine was left the shed. It would have been made up possibly by hand and not with a shovel, using Welsh coal. And the blocks would have been put in on a well-prepared initial fire bed. In the 45 minutes or so before they leave the shed, that fire begins to heat up. Welsh coal takes a while to cook, and as you know, it swells as it cooks. By the time the engine arrived at Waterloo, another half an hour after that, the whole of the fire would be coking and hot. The fireman would then, having coupled his train onto the engine, put the headboards on at the front of the engine. He'd climb back into the cab, he'd get the dart down, the big inch diameter poker, and he'd stick it down vertically into the fire, and it would sink through it if it was in a good condition, like a knife going through a nice fruit cake. And it would hit the bars at the bottom, and he would then lift the fire up slightly, 6 or 8 inches, in 3 places at the back of the firebox, which would let the air thoroughly through the fire. The engine would begin to buzz at the safety valves. He'd whack the injectors on to keep it quiet if there was room in the boiler, and he'd lean out looking back for the signal from the guard. The driver would be sitting on his seat thinking about the road ahead, what speed restrictions he'd got, how good the fire looked, and how much confidence he had in the fireman. And he'd have the engine in full 4 gear, the cocks open to let the water drain out. The brake, he'd watch the gauge to see the guard test the brake, and the moment the guard had tested his brake, he'd know the next thing the guard will do is jump out of his brake van and wave a flag to say go. He'd look up at the signals to make sure they were still off, and everything is coming to a crescendo. Everything is building up in terms of tension and readiness and expectation. And the people on the platform are waiting, the guard is ready, and all of a sudden the whistle blows, the fireman says right away, he shuts the firebox door so that the cold air isn't drawn through over the fire but through it underneath, confirms that the signal's off, The driver slams the cock shut if the engine's hot, but leaves them open if they're not, and goes for the regulator. And he gives it a big tug, and as I've said, he works to the steam chest pressure gauge to avoid slipping. You might need a bit of sand. But sand slows the train down as it follows. And the other thing sand does, it destroys the electrical contact for signal and telegraph use. You'd pull out of Waterloo, have a look across on the fireman's side to Big Ben, which you used to be able to see, and check what time they'd actually sent you away, and then you'd pull over all the points and crossings until you got down onto the down main through. And then you'd accelerate the engine with a little more regulator, start pulling the reverser back from full gear to about 50%, back to 40%. The engine would be rising along 40 miles an hour through Vauxhall at 40 miles an hour, let the engine increase its speed, then down to Clapham, 60 miles an hour past the Clapham washing plant. He would put the blower on slightly to avoid a blowback, slam the regulator shut, and the engine would then coast at 60 miles an hour towards Clapham Junction, where there was a 40 mile an hour restriction. Between the washer and Clapham, the speed would sink to 40 without having to use the brake, and then having bucketed your way round the bend at Clapham, you'd open up the regulator again and drive it up the hill to Earlsfield and down into Wimbledon. And you had 7 minutes to pass Clapham from starting away at Waterloo, and that was quite difficult to do. 5 miles in 7 minutes.
They'd hoped to make up time galloping at 85 or 90 miles an hour through the countryside, and there are stories of bullets topping a ton towards the end of steam. On a good day, a state of harmony was achieved between man and machine. For many drivers and firemen, this was simply bliss.
When everything's running beautifully, your fireman is working like an angel, giving you all the steam you want, keeping the footplate spotless, catching all the signals on the blind side. Neither of you saying a word to each other, but everything just beautifully managed.